All right, let's go ahead and get started. I want to begin today by picking up just one thing from the discussion last week, and something that Derek said that I thought was really good, and it got me thinking. So I was talking about last week. I was talking about what does Paul mean when he says to place a son, that we translate as adoption, and one of the things I've said about my own process is that when I encounter Paul saying something, I try and ask myself, where did Jesus say this? And I didn't do that, right? Because I said last week, both in the meditation and then in the class, I said, Paul's the only one who talks about this. And it never occurred to me to say, wait a minute, Greg, that can't be true. Paul has to be saying something Jesus said, right? So I didn't follow my own advice, my own kind of thing I try and do. And then when Derek referenced the parable of the prodigal son, he said, well, in the parable of the prodigal son, he's always a son. And that was such a good comment. And of course, it registered better with me once class was over, and I thought, yeah. And so I was thinking, well, if Jesus never talks about us being, as it were, fatherless, and then us being adopted into God's family when we weren't in God's family, and if that's not what Jesus talks about, and maybe, as I was suggesting, that's not what Paul means, I thought, well, where does Jesus say something that's like it? And I think the parable of the prodigal son gives us what Paul means when he says to place a son. And I think what happens in that parable, when the son comes back and the father gives him the robe and the signet ring, and we all know what the signet ring is, right? That's the ring which has the family seal, into which he can press it on wax seals to make official decisions for the family business. It's like
in the name of.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Jim was talking about, is when his dad was saying, someday, son, this will all be yours, but he knew it wasn't his yet, right? And so I kind of think that what Paul means by adoption is not we were fatherless, we weren't the children of God, he makes children. That what he means is he brings us into the full standing of being the sons and daughters that we have always been by creation, but were never by our own participation and our own being, people of faith. I think that happens for Jesus in that parable. The son comes back and he says, here's a signet ring. Now he places him as the son. He gives him that status. You've come of age, even though he didn't do anything to earn it. Right? He just showed up sheepishly. Anyway, so I wanted to share that. I thought that was a really good comment, and it's going to make me think further. If Jesus doesn't talk about it in those terms, where does Jesus talk about this making us children in his thinking? But the thing I wanted to talk about today was I'm going to talk a little bit about faith, because that also came up in last week's discussion. And Bob had emphasized that in one of his comments. He said, so we need to take this by faith. We need to have faith about this. And that got me to thinking, yeah, and I want to make sure that we are thinking deeply and carefully about what we mean when we're saying we need to take this by faith, right? What are we talking about? So I'll kind of get us started, and then we'll see where the discussion goes, what you want to add to it as we go along. So we're probably all familiar with the way that we can distinguish sometimes we do it with the language, the difference between belief and faith, right? And somewhat that can be an artificial distinction, but there's a meaningful difference that we're talking about. A lot of times we can talk about belief as accepting something as actually true. That's kind of a bare minimum meaning of, do you believe it? Well, yeah, I believe it. But that's different than what is the idea of having faith. And in Scripture, one of my professors said, 90% of the time, faith has to do with trust. And there's a few times where it's exception, or even the word belief has to do with trusting most of the time. There's a few times where contextually it's talking more about accepting as something is factual, is actual. But most of the time it's talking about trust. So there's a big difference between accepting something as, well, yeah, that is the case, and putting my trust in something, relying on it, would be another way to talk about it. So if we are thinking about those differences, then when we're talking about something being the occasion for faith or belief, we're not generally talking about the idea that you must kind of conjure up some sort of mental strength in order to believe something to be actually true when maybe you're not sure, right? In other words, you could say, Greg, you've got to believe that the moon is made of cheese. And I'd be like, well, okay, I'll try. I'm going to try and believe that. I'm going to try and believe this to be the fact. Of course, inwardly, I'm harboring lots of doubts, but I'm struggling to believe it. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about faith. I think when we're talking about faith, trusting something, rather than in something that seems to be not actually the case, and I'm trying to believe it is the case when it actually seems to not be the case, faith is trusting in something that actually does seem to be the case. There is a kind of real logic to it. Our faith is not about believing things that do not appear to be true, and like somehow as Christians we're just going to buckle down and believe it anyway. That's not what God's looking for. I think there is a kind of logic, reasonableness to what we're talking about as the faith, that it does hold together and it does make sense. And what I'm being asked to do, to have faith, is to trust that rather than it doesn't really hold together, it doesn't make sense, but I'm being asked to, quote unquote, believe it. Right? And to me, those are two very different scenarios. So anyway, I don't know if I've even described the difference well. So maybe you have some questions or thoughts, and then I'm gonna try and illustrate it. I'm going to take us on the difference between believing a certain thing or having faith in it.
A caveat on that would be that doesn't mean you're not going to have doubts because you have faith.
Oh, no.
Ultimately, I'm going to, in spite of those doubts, I will trust that that's the case, right?
Right. No, so even if there's a certain reasonableness to it, right? Right? I mean, I think there's a certain logic to the whole idea of what we're talking about as the Christian way of perspective, the way we look at things. There's a logic that God has created us, that God deeply loves us, that we have, well, this is probably pretty obvious, fallen into disobedience. Anybody going to deny that's the case? And that yet God in this unfathomable love has taken extraordinary measures to rescue it. I mean, that makes sense, right? That's not a bizarre, nonsensical type of story. It's a story that makes sense. Now, the struggle might be, I may sometimes struggle to actually believe that God can love me that deeply. I can have doubts there. It's like, yeah, I know the story says I'm deeply loved, but I really feel like a jerk, and I'm pretty sure I'm unlovable, right? So I can have lots of doubts about it on that level, and I could also have doubts about other aspects of it, right? But the struggle for the faith we're talking about is not, it's trusting it and living into it and relying on it as that's the real narrative guiding my existence, as opposed to I'm being asked to believe that the moon's made of green cheese, and I'm trying my best to do that because that's what we're supposed to do, right? That would be my analogy, right? Bob?
I think of you comes to me somewhat differently. When I look at the superstructure, if you will, of Christianity, it is certainly logical, consistent, to a flawless degree, if you really look at it hard. And that all makes sense to me. I understand that, it makes sense, but when you start digging into the foundation of it, as you used to like to say, going through the different layers of the onion, if you will, ultimately you're going to get down to a set of beliefs, much like postulates, that you just have to take as trust or on faith. And my preference is to see the world that way, because I think it's a more livable place than without it. But it's hard for me to get through that because the amount of doubt that I have is significant.
Yeah, I think that's, and what you're talking about foundations, there can be very specific parts of, okay, so even Jesus' resurrection from the dead, that a truly dead guy came out of the tomb, okay? That is, that challenges me to trust that happened, right? So I had the very awful experience when a boat sank in Lake Victoria. I felt so horrible about 1,000 people died when the MV Vukova capsized about a mile offshore. It was coming into dock. And I wanted to do something, and they had turned the soccer stadium into a morgue. And so I went down to help, because there's nothing worse than feeling helpless in a situation like that. And so we were 3 days after the capsizing, and I'm down there helping laying the bodies out in rows, men here, women here, so that relatives could file through trying to find their loved ones, right? And one of the things I was thinking is, these people have been dead for 3 days. I ain't thinking any of them are going to get up at this point. And part of it was challenging to me was I'm thinking of Jesus raising Lazarus, and I'm faced with the reality of laying these bodies out, and could I really believe that one of these could come back to life? So there's a part of me that is challenged on the material, the kind of scientific part of that, right? And I'm saying we can have lots of doubts. In other words, how do you live into the story when it says this is foundational to the understanding? But what really does speak to me about the resurrection is that although I have no way of putting in, thinking about it as the literal event, in other words, it just surpasses my ability to see how that could happen, but it speaks powerfully about the understanding that death is not the final word on anything, that life always comes from death, and that somehow that was manifested in the life of Jesus in a way that baffles me, right? But I think the testimony would be it absolutely baffled the disciples. Is it a ghost? They didn't know how to wrap their heads around, this seems to be Jesus, but then it kind of doesn't seem to be Jesus. He doesn't seem to appear to be Jesus. We don't recognize him by his face, but then he says things and we recognize him by his voice. Strangest thing, right? So, yeah, if we struggle at certain points with those types of parts of the faith, I got no problem saying, we struggle with some of that, and that's okay. But what about that larger thing? And maybe that's what Bob's saying. The superstructure the way it all comes together to tell me a story that says life springs from death. It's always in that order. Death then life, not life then death and all ends in bleakness. But it's a story of hope. That resonates with me very much so. And then I see that, right? Like Richard Rohr would say, yeah, but the world's full of resurrection, right? Every winter is followed by spring, right? And things die, but then they come back to life. And the night gives way to dawn again. And he says the pattern's here in everything. Why would we not think the pattern would hold true for us? And so but when you say, yeah, but my death will result in life, well, that's a more challenging thing because now you're talking beyond my experience, right? I can experience all the other things and I can see what he's saying. There's a pattern and I can trust a bigger story. But then when it comes down to the specifics, yeah, maybe at that point I'm really challenged. And that's okay. That's okay.
The reason I'm sitting here is because God answered all my questions. But do I understand how that fits together? That's the
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, because that we have those kinds of uncertainties and don't know what to do with something in that sense, doubting how to understand it or even how to think about it. I don't think that's not standing in the way of trusting the larger story, right?
I get on a plane and I have no idea how it works.
Yeah.
I trust that somebody does.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's, and there could be analogies like that. Yeah. Yeah. It's trusting in something bigger, even if I can't work out all the details, right?
One of the things that I have discovered is that I have to fight to believe. And so fight to believe it involves coming before, in my imagination, many times, and in Scripture, this really, really big God, and knowing that I don't know everything there is to know. In other words, the reality that I will never know. And that I'm needing to live into the mystery of something greater than I am. And so, I enter the fight to believe through memorizing incredible pieces of Scripture, bowing my knee before an invisible God, and then an image I like to carry in my head is what was the faith of Christ. Not do I believe in Christ, not what is my faith in Christ, but what was the faith of Christ.
Yeah.
And to try to imagine, he had absolute faith in his Father.
Yeah.
And so that takes me to just this bigger God than I can imagine.
Right.
Because, who can imagine God?
Right.
Infinite, immortal, and so, we, our faith is even, we're trusting in God to take us there.
Right.
Because we are weak, and when we hit the wall of unbelief because life is hard, or because he doesn't seem to be answering our prayers, or we encounter a theology that is just too hard to believe, even in all of that, you're trusting in God to take you where you need to go. But there's a battle
Yeah.
for faith.
Yeah.
We have to fight to believe because it is unimaginable.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying. Okay, Aviva, go ahead. You jump in there.
I think I'm spitting your words back out at you from my notes. But I have in here.
I forget a lot of the things I say. They sound new to me, so go ahead.
I think it's you, but just put your initials on it. That God draws faith out of us, that God calls and initiates the birth of faith. And the story was taken from Genesis 12, from the story of Abraham. And I can go through if you want me to. But I love how you went through that, and you talked about how God initiated the birth of faith in Abraham. and for us to be able to call, it made me think a lot about what Baxter Kruger was saying, which is our ability to be sensitive and to know and have a knowing about the Spirit, to see those times when God is initiating the birth of faith in us for that journey, and that it's not just us doing it, it's Him initiating it and us partnering in that journey to
Yeah.
develop into the faith of, the mature faith that we can have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Yeah. Thanks for taking notes. And probably synthesizing the things I was saying and making them sound better in your notes than they ever came out of my mouth.
It changes matter.
Yeah.
Part of it to me, I know is affected so much by how I grew up
Yeah.
and what I was told and taught all those years. I don't have any issue with Jesus being raised from the dead because I've always been taught that. Your lesson this morning of God's ocean of love for us. That's nice. I didn't hear that. And everything I hear about that is in direct contradiction to what I heard growing up, and that's tough.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation, because where we struggle has a lot to do with our own formation and our own story and our own experience. Yeah. And okay, but to pull together some of the things like what Linda was talking about was there was a point where I realized that I wanted my God to be beyond my comprehension. Prior to that, I wanted him to show up and make sense to me, until I realized if he did, he wouldn't have been that great. Right? Right? And so there's a kind of logic to, well, wouldn't you expect there to be mystery? Wouldn't you expect for you to be awestruck in the face of things you cannot understand? So in some ways, I can strangely take comfort in my uncertainties. Does that make sense? Because now what's the comfort? Because God's bigger than Greg, and he can absolutely astound me and confuse me, and I don't even know how things can be true. In that way, that makes logical sense. So I can come to the resurrection, and I can think, how can a body be transformed into some heavenly body and then come forth from the tomb and be vital and no longer corrupt? I have no idea. I've encountered nothing in the world that speaks to me of how that could be, right? And yet, something rings, again, very true, that a God story would have such incredible things in it. If it didn't, it wouldn't be much of a God story, or we would have a pretty small deity, right, who didn't do the incredible, right? And we throw around words like infinite. Yeah, infinite. Nobody knows what infinite means, obviously. Nobody knows. We're finite. We know nothing that's infinite. And yet we throw it around in math and all kinds of infinite this, and make your little symbol in math. This is infinite. Nobody knows what that means, right? We pretend like we know what we're talking about, right? So that's part of what, to me, is, that's the logic of it. But almost kind of a strange logic, because early in life I wanted the logic to be absolutely comprehensible. And now it's logical that is not absolutely comprehensible. And that's logical, right? Does that make it? It's like, well, that is, what was I expecting except a God who does the incredible and the one-off thing that then you've got nothing to compare it to? When else has this ever happened? It never has happened. It only happened apparently this one time, so far, and it's being and I'm being told, but that's going to be what will happen for everyone,
Creation.
right? So yeah. So there's only been one creation, right? So there's a kind of logic even to being confounded by parts of the story. Well, that makes it sound more like it's a divine story, and one worth trusting in. Okay, real quick. So I thought it was a really easy illustration would be the story of Jonah. So I grew up kind of thinking that if I believe the story of Jonah, I believe that a man was actually swallowed by some large whale/fish. That's what it meant to believe it, is that you believe this actually happened. And then there were stories of whalers, whatever, that we would say to say this is not implausible. But to have faith in that story is to ask myself, apart from whether or not I view it as a parable or a literal event, either way, it doesn't matter. To have faith in the story, how do I trust in the story of Jonah? As opposed to the question of whether I believe it to be an actual event or was it an ancient story that was told parable-like, okay? That doesn't matter. What does it mean to trust that story? What are some of the things it would mean to trust that story? Yeah?
There's a greater truth than just the story itself. You're trusting it.
Yeah, the greater truth. And I'm asking, what are some of those greater truths that are the real sign of whether I believe the story of Jonah? What does the story of Jonah say about God? What is the greater truth?
His mercy, his grace, his kindness.
Okay, so it's a story about the radical mercy, kindness, grace of God. Do I trust? Do I believe the story of Jonah? In other words, do I believe, like John's saying, apart from what I was taught, that there is an ocean of mercy to take up all the world's sins, which are just a handful of dust? That's what the story of Jonah is saying, right? But it's possible to believe that Jonah was swallowed by this sea creature and yet not trust, not have any faith in that story at all. Does that make sense? What really matters is whether I have faith in the story. It matters not as much as, well, what kind of, was that a baleen whale, that doesn't matter, right?
Not the how.
Yeah, exactly. It's not the how. So what are some other greater truths maybe that come out of that story that I can live into?
That the 3 days, changing our viewpoints and coming in line with God is like being swallowed by something.
Yes. So you start asking, well, what needs to swallow me up, take me down to the depths, and then I get spit out again. Right. And Jesus uses it that way. I'm going to get swallowed up into the earth, but then I'm going to arise. So he sees it as kind of a metaphor for the spiritual journey. Yeah. The pig pen swallowed up the prodigal son, and then he was spit out back at the doorstep of his father's house, you could say. Right? So, Baptism. Yeah. It becomes this image of baptism. Yeah. Right? So the thing is, now here's the question. Do I trust that pattern holds true? That even though things can swallow me up in this world, that's not the end? Do I hold that's a truth? There's the faith. Do I trust it? Especially when I'm getting swallowed, right? When I'm being swallowed, it's like, help me, I'm being swallowed. But do I trust, hey, I've got all these spiritual truths spoken to me in poetry and narrative and in all sorts of ways that say this holds true, right? Does that make sense? That would be, to me, having faith in the story as opposed to simply whether or not we believe the story.
That's better than the rest of the class talking about the whale.
Right. Yeah, exactly, because that's missing the point in spades. Right? When we get caught up on how could this happen scientifically, how did he breathe, can a man live, you're missing the point. This is not the point of the story. The point of the story is the trajectory of what's happening. Who is God? What is man? What is our spiritual struggle? And God has as much mercy on Jonah as he does on Nineveh, right? Yeah.
So the other thing is, the big lesson to me is God never gives up on you.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because look, you got the Nineveh and Jonah's like, I am sick of it. Look at them, they're so wicked. And God could have said, Zap, I've had it with you. I got you out of the way. Yeah, I've had it with you. But he didn't.
Exactly.
The plant. And then the worm. All that.
He's still
God never
teaching
gives up
Jonah.
on you.
Yeah. So do I trust this story that no matter how stubborn, how wayward, how sinful I get, God is still like pursuing me. And I try and run away, but
It's
he's,
even more than pursuing, though. It's if he loves me.
yeah, pursuing me out of love.
I think it's plausible that you could be in a well for 3 days.
Yeah.
I didn't have the struggle you did. But what I do find very difficult is that God can love me when
Yes.
I don't love myself. When
Right.
I see love demonstrated to other people is horrible.
Right.
And he loves me, that's not possible.
Right.
It's not even probable.
Right.
But it kinda concerns me about the way he shows me his love, if he's gonna have me swallowed by a whale. I mean, Jonah is
sometimes
there
it's
because
necessary.
he said, no, I don't wanna do that.
Yeah.
And he went the other way.
Yeah. Which is a warning, which is don't try and, not surrender early. My motto is surrender early. It goes better if you surrender early. Because he will lovingly pursue me to win me back. But the story is, I can choose to make it just as difficult as I want to make it. But that's on me, right? So that's where the story,
Some of us choose to remain in the whale.
Yeah, you can choose to remain in the whale.
Just lay the hole.
Yeah.
You love the way.
All right. We're going to stop here. But thank you for the conversation. We're having a meal. Hope you can stay for it. We're dismissed.